All right, everyone seeing that screen? Great.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for joining today. It's exciting to see you all see your faces here on screen, and want to welcome you to our subject matter expert roundtable, how to launch your company without breaking the bank. And we've got great panel here that I'll be introducing shortly joining us to answer some questions about company launch planning. And quick intros about me. A lot of you on this webinar don't know who I am, so I wanted to give a quick introduction. I'm Renee Cohen. I'll be the roundtable moderator today, and I recently joined Norwest as operating executive for our marketing portfolio services. And the role of our portfolio services team is to support founders and leadership teams at our portfolio companies. And sometimes this looks like answering questions about org structure or helping source executive candidates. And we can get very specific and work alongside you on very specific initiatives. So for example, helping right size your budget to achieve certain pipeline targets, or maybe working on an initiative to help you develop a lead lifecycle definitions and set up a RevOps function. So it can really range the gamut. And the reason why we came up with this topic today is because we have been hearing from a number of founders about how to get ready to launch a company. So we created this roundtable panel to help answer those questions, as well as a companion piece that I want to share a little bit about with you today. So these folks on the panel today helped to develop a playbook, essentially, that we are making available to our early stage companies about preparing for a company launch. So I'll give you a little sneak peek into that playbook. And when I was interviewing some founders, just sourcing the information to answer the questions that were top of mind about preparing for company launch, a couple themes emerged. So first, every company launch is different. So we were kind of unpacking that with a number of different founders. So everyone has a little bit different priorities in terms of who their audience is, where they're at with their product development, and what their overall goals are. And everybody also had consistent questions around how to gauge how big to go and where to compromise. Resources are limited, right? Like you're trying to conserve cash in all areas of your business. So what's the right caliber of spend? And so even for those who launched a company previously, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, things change, costs change, and they might have done some things differently. And so we tapped into our robust network of advisors to create this launch playbook. And there are a number of other tools as well that we've created alongside this to help our companies and to help marketing leadership at a time of launch. And so just a quick sneak peek into some of the content. We're not going to go over all of it today. We're going to dive into the panel and do more of a Q&A conversation, but the playbook covers how to define a launch, including prompts that are going to help you capture your specific objectives so that you can hone in on the right plan and the tactics to achieve those objectives. And we include benchmark and templates for things like sample KPIs to track. We include how to budget for some big ticket initiatives like branding and your website and example launch scenarios. So just giving you some guidance, knowing that your journey is going to be your own and that we're here to support you along the way in finding the right path for your specific company. And then as I mentioned, we also have some additional companion pieces and materials that we've created alongside this. So we have a marketing specific launch playbook that gets a little bit more tactical into the project planning, and also a how to build your ICP playbook, and even more materials that I'm not showcasing here today. So I do want to let everyone know that we're going to send the full playbook to everybody after today's roundtable, along with the recording of the roundtable. All right, now jumping into the fun part, the folks that we have joining us today are some of the thought leaders who contributed to this content. So I'd love if you could kind of go around and do some quick introductions about yourselves. Jill, do you mind sharing a little bit about yourself?
Yes, happy to. And thanks, Renee. And great to be here with everyone. So I am Jill Melchionda, and I'm a senior advisor for Norwest, really around the area of brand strategy. And I have had, I guess 25 years at this point working with brands large and small. I've done a fair amount of consulting on directly on the client side, but the majority of my time has been really leading agencies that are focused on both B2B and B2C. Although I have a lot of experience across many facets of marketing, I have to admit my passion has really landed in the area of brand building, and that includes strategy and activation. The reason I'm incredibly passionate about brand is because I believe it's the most powerful way to tell your story and really establish and differentiate companies. And brand plays an incredibly vital role and is a key ingredient in amplifying all brands and establishing your company. So really happy to be here. Thanks, Renee.
Great. Thanks for joining us, Jill. And thanks for all your support in helping to develop these materials too, that our companies are going to get so much value out of. And also we have Teresa Maloney, who's a PR and Marcom veteran and the founder and CEO of Cogenta Communications. So hi, Teresa. Why don't you tell our attendees a little bit more about you and Cogenta?
Hey, Renee, nice to be here and thanks for having me. Cogenta Communications is a boutique firm that specializes in launches, pivots, and just about anything that happens in the course of a startup's life cycle. We've been around for about 20 years and I've been working in the area of technology and communications for about 25 years myself. I also am a consultant with Norwest and work on all the funding announcements that pass through the firm. And just really excited to talk about what's going on today because the market is changing, as everybody knows.
Great. Yep. And yeah, we're definitely going to get into a little bit of that change in some of the questions that we have today. And Ranjit Vidwans, I want to introduce you as well. Ranjit brings some deep expertise in product marketing, business development for enterprise startups. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
For sure. Thanks a ton, Renee. And hi, everyone. I'm Ranjit. So I've been working with the Norwest Portfolio Services team for coming up on a year now. I, like Jill, have about 25 years of experience in the industry. And I started out in very technical roles as a developer and a network engineer. And then I gravitated more and more towards the front office. I became an SC, then I became a product manager. And then for the last many years, I've been CMO, VP of Biz Dev, EVP strategy, roles like that. And in my capacity with Norwest, I help our portfolio companies with product marketing. So specifically tapping into my prior technical background, really understanding what are the aspects of the product or platform or service that a particular portfolio company is building and how it really adds value to the target market. So in areas of messaging, content, competitive differentiation, things of that nature. So excited to be here and talk with all of you. Thanks so much, Renee.
Great, thank you. And I had so much fun preparing. I'm going to go off screen here so that we can see everyone's faces as we dive into the questions today. And we had so much fun preparing this topic. I know, we got together to kind of map out what do we want to, share with our companies, and we were all saying how we wished we had recorded that because it was so just the conversation was so great between this group. And one of the first topics that jumped out as we were preparing was the importance of timing and how there's, a lot of kind of sometimes build up and tension around that timing, and our founders have internal drivers around funding or revenue targets that push everything forward. And sometimes it feels like it could just be going at a fast and furious pace. And Teresa, you told us a really great success story about how sometimes having a little bit of flexibility and adaptability and almost what I would say is being opportunistic around timing can create more excitement and pickup. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I think one of the first engagements that I did with Norwest was with a company called Third Wave Automation, one of their portfolio companies. And last summer, they were planning to announce their Series B. They'd had some experience pitching TechCrunch without any success on previous news. And so we engaged with them and helped them get their Series B into TechCrunch, working with Christina Korosek, who also covers companies like Tesla. And that's one of the big misnomers I think that founders don't realize going into a launch is the people who are going to cover your launch as an early stage company are also covering these huge companies that make headlines. And so we talked to the folks over at Third Wave and said, hey, maybe we should offer a little flexibility rather than go out with the news next week, because we knew that Christina's plate was full. One of the things that's sort of a tip I offer is follow the reporters you're looking at on Twitter. See what they're doing, because it was through Twitter that we learned that Christina's plate was just, I will say, it was spilling over with Elon Musk. And so they followed our lead and offered some flexibility. Now, fortunately, they had not filed their Form D, and that's something I will caution. If you're going to offer flexibility, talk to your attorneys and make sure you can, in fact, offer flexibility, because there are some legal paperwork that you have to fill out on the other end. But we were able to work around TechCrunch's schedule. It took about 3 weeks to negotiate the story. And we still had to keep our fingers crossed because we didn't know what Elon was going to be announcing, and that news would have trumped ours. She even said that on the phone with the CEO. But the story came out. We were able to pitch far and wide, meaning we went out to all of the trades thereafter, and we got the splash in TechCrunch that we were looking for, along with some deeper technology stories in the more meaningful trades that matter to them. So I'd say the more flexibility you offer, the better. And funding is slowing, or there's a perception that it's slowing. The media is carrying that perception through right now. So just because you see fewer funding announcements, that does not mean that your story will be picked up or that the reporters are just scraping for news. You're now up against a lot of other coverage, layoffs, and what I call sort of a pessimistic environment that the media is talking about, because those headlines draw people, they draw traffic to the sites. So even though it doesn't seem like as many funding announcements are out there, they are out there. And we're still finding that if companies don't offer the reporter flexibility and enough time to really understand their story, they sometimes miss the boat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in that case, with Third Wave, it sounds like, very successful. Most companies that we've been talking to are in the portcos. They define launch success a little bit differently, but everybody kind of would love a feature in TechCrunch if they could get one, for sure. But across the board, funding teams are looking to us for some guidance on what good should look like after launch, beyond just, some of the headline publications. And Jill, you've got a good approach that got us excited when we were prepping for the panel. I like how you kind of branded the approach of planning for your launch outcomes. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think when you begin to think about what your objectives are, it's incredibly important to get clarity among your stakeholders. What are you really looking for? What are you trying to accomplish? And of course, outline some expected outcomes and goals. Beyond that, though, I think many companies don't ask themselves what could go wrong here, and how do we plan for and define how we're going to address issues that could come up and get in our way. So we talk about having a pre-mortem. So essentially really getting your group together and understanding, and in an honest conversation, really, what do we think could get in the way within our organization, within the market dynamics, and what are the things that we should really foresee and plan ahead for? They could be potential challenges that could come up, like perhaps this reporter was incredibly busy covering Elon. or it could be, you know, internal issues that could really cause problems in getting your planned launch to market. So, you know, we called that a bit of a pre-mortem, and the importance of really having those honest conversations up front and ahead of going to market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved that term pre-mortem, just to define that process. I think it forces the discipline around having the conversation, even though, you know, folks, you know, sometimes think they're defining that, but maybe haven't put the rigor into really mapping out what those outcomes could look like, the good and potentially the not as good, where you might come up with some creative ways to pivot, right? If you start thinking ahead to what those different scenarios could be. And in addition to doing that pre-mortem exercise, we're finding that it's often best to engage with a marketing advisor when you think that you're going to be ready to launch, and kind of get out ahead of that a little bit to help define those ideal launch outcomes and give some guidance on how to prepare for a launch. And I'd love to just go around the circle here and ask each of you to share, what do you think is overlooked when a company starts to kick off its plans for launch? And Ranjit, I'll start with you.
Sure, yeah. So I think having worked both as an employee at a bunch of different startups, and now as an advisor to our portfolio companies through Norwest, I think one common misstep that gets overlooked, so like thing one, right? I've got 2 young kids. So thing one is that you really, really need a quarterback for the launch program. Like, you need to treat it like a project and have someone that's going to be accountable for the successful execution of that program, and that one that's aligned with those expectations, like Jill spoke about in the concept of the pre-mortem, which I also love. So as a founder, CEO, you're of course going to have final say on, you know, big decisions like, hey, this reporter, Elon, actually just announced something, so we're going to have to slip by 2 weeks if we want this coverage. You're of course going to be crucially involved in those, but you're going to need someone on the ground that can make the tactical trade-offs. That's going to drive the team to say, all right, well, the website's slipping by a week, but that's okay. It's not on the critical path, things like that. And really, that person is going to be accountable to you for making sure that key milestones that could actually jeopardize your data or your objectives are surfaced up to you, so that you can have, as again Jill said, an honest conversation about, hey, is this trade-off worth it? Should we slip? Should we go without it? Things like that. And you may, as a founder and potentially CEO, you may think that quarterback's going to be you. Spoiler alert, it is not. You are going to be dealing with recruiting, with fundraising, with closing key deals, like everything that you need to do to run your business. And so whether it's an advisor like we provide through Portfolio Services, or an internal marketing leader, or an outsider that you bring in, but it really has to be someone that's got marketing expertise, and for whom this will be their primary goal for those 2, 3, 4 months, whatever it takes you to execute your launch. So I think that to me, that's the one thing that gets like, oh yeah, I can do this as a side hustle, as a CEO, and you really don't overlook that.
That's a great moment to help everyone self-reflect a little bit and hopefully realize the truth in that statement. Jill, what do you see as often overlooked in launch prep?
You know, I think sometimes you can underestimate the importance and the scale of these efforts, and you can think about maybe your most important audience, who are your future customers or your future investors. But the one thing that I think is often overlooked is sort of the cohesive messaging and touch point alignment. And, you know, you think about your partners, your internal audiences, your board as stakeholders to this. So really thinking about having your quarterback, to Ranjit's point, think about those different touch points and make sure that you have not only the messaging and the visual design of your brand aligned and represented to those audiences, but making sure you actually have a touch plan where you're bringing those constituents along on the journey. I think sometimes we think about launch to your point, Teresa, as we're launching to the market, you need to really make sure that the internal stakeholders, as well as your other organizational stakeholders, are along on that journey and have messaging and storytelling that aligns with each of their mindsets.
Yeah, and Teresa, feel free to jump in too. I think we've talked too about kind of that prep ahead of time so that everybody is kind of briefed going in with that coaching essentially for media briefing. And any other things that you see as overlooked in that process?
You know, I think first of all, Ranjit and Jill hit both of the biggest issues we see. Having somebody inside the company who can carry the announcement through, having clear, concise messaging. It's going to be different from your brand messaging, and it's going to be free of jargon. Reporters do not like jargon. So going forward with like 3 to 5 really top level messages that tie back to the market, super important. Timing, which we talked about earlier, also super important. You don't just put an announcement out next week, and usually that's the call that we get from a company is, I have an announcement, we're closing our funding next week, can you help me out? You need probably a good 6 weeks in a perfect world, but a minimum of 2 weeks in a chaotic world to get the message, the visuals, because you'll need visuals. You got to get your press release, not just through your internal cycle, but you have to remember your constituents, as Jill was saying, make sure any investor in that round has had a chance to look at it. Do not send it to them the day before, because often there are corrections and, or just, you know, a feeling of, hey, I got to see it before it went out. You can also really work with Norwest or your other investors to make sure that they're amplifying your message. So if you have that timing, you can work on having your investors put out posts. You can have a coordination between different parties so that you have even more social feeds going out there, which can be really helpful, especially if a company is young, they're trying to hire, they're looking for new customers. So I think it's just really, you know, giving themselves enough time to develop a good plan and working with the right people. Sometimes, you know, I think almost every founder I've met could probably do my job truly if they had time to dedicate to it and they knew all of the things that went on behind the scenes. Unfortunately, as I think it was Ranjit was pointing out, they have a lot of other things that they're responsible for. So if you can bring somebody in to help out during that period, I think it's going to really help you take your message to market.
And even thinking through that timing as well, you'd mentioned 6 weeks being kind of like ideal for that's for the pitching, right? Like that's for the announcement itself, but kind of going back to even some of the things we were saying at the beginning of this panel of setting your objectives, there may be other things with a longer tail that should be even considered along the way. Like, hey, you know, what is the experience after somebody, you know, reads this announcement? Do you want them to go back to your site? Do you have a site yet? And does that continue the conversation there? And so there may be other aspects of getting ready, depending on your objectives, that add a little bit more time to really pay off the outcomes that you're looking for. And so it kind of pairing with that question of, well, how much time should it take? I also have heard everybody asking that we've talked to, how much should I spend? What's the right amount for us to spend on our launch activities? And it really is going to depend. But Ranjit, you and I were talking about how launching it really is a spectrum. And in the process of developing this playbook that we're going to be sending around to everybody, we talk about that concept quite a bit. Can you address that a little bit more about launching as a spectrum and how that impacts spend?
Yeah, for sure. I think if I remember our conversation, Renee, we were talking about how a launch can be everything from like a simple Hello World blog post on your own site, all the way through to a billboard in Times Square, or even like a Super Bowl commercial, right? Like classic marketing example from the 1984 Mac announcement. So it really comes down to a handful of things. Like, so I'll get to the actual spend expectation in a moment, but it really has to square up with those expectations that the objectives and outcomes that you want. out of the launch, right? And the other piece of that is, what do you already have? If you've already got your messaging at least 80% figured out, maybe it needs some refinement, that's great. It gives you a leg up. If you don't, that's going to be something you're going to have to spend time and money on. So if you think about each of the components that go into a launch, right? So there's PR and the expertise that that Teresa and her cohort bring to the table. And by the way, Teresa, I challenge you on the fact that our founders could do your job as effectively as you. I do not think that is the case. But so there's PR, there's brand, there's website. All of it is like the underlying foundation for that is message. So if you don't have any of those pieces, you're going to have to spend a little bit more. If you have a couple of those pieces in place, you might have to spend a little bit less. So with that context setting at a broad brush level, again, I think, Renee, you made the point that everyone's journey is their own, and I think that's 100% right. But I would budget at least 50K, if not even like 100, depending on how many of those pieces you need. If you think you're going to be able to get by and do something for sub 50K, I think you're not going to meet your objectives. I think you can do it for 30K if you want, but then you're going to look back on it and be like, gosh, well, that didn't really work out the way I wanted. So there's a lot of variability in terms of what you want to get out of it, what you already have in place, how much time you have, right? You can always trade off time with money. If you've got a 9-month window, then you might be able to do a lot more stuff in-house without bringing in outside help. But to generalize, I would say 50K absolute minimum, and really 100K to execute a successful launch. That's the expectation I would set.
Right. And the point being, it really depends on what building blocks are in place that are needed to achieve the outcome. And one aspect of that is how far to go with brand. And Jill, we were talking a lot about, I think this is where, it can get really, there's so much variability, right? Like in terms of brand. And if you think about brand as just a logo, someone's like, oh, I can get a logo for cheap. It's so much more than that. And so Jill, can you talk a little bit more about, but on the other hand, our company is, with, let's call it 5 million in funding. That might be even on the high end for some companies. They can't afford to necessarily spend, 500K on a branding engagement. And so what's the right trade-off there of how much to invest in building brand early on, knowing that this is a journey for the company, how far to go on that brand development and website build, Jill?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think agree with everything Ranjit said around sort of prioritization and what you have to begin with. And I think when you think about the concept of brand, you've got to think about it as this is the expression of your vision of the world and as a company too. So it's your mission, it's your vision, and it's your values and your expression of that brand, from a visual and verbal perspective is helping the market to understand your point of view. So I'm a big believer in that foundational work being really clearly established and defined before you start to really represent yourself in a website or a PowerPoint deck. I think, but for most companies, your website is absolutely your front door and frankly, the most important touch point for your brand. So it's an incredibly important vehicle. I think one of the things that, I'm a believer in is invest in the foundation, and then your expression of that foundation can take shape over time and continue to evolve over time. So in other words, make sure you have your brand story and your positioning and your narrative set, but then do a really simple, well-designed website, but maybe not a deep website. Do a simple and well-designed storytelling presentation, PowerPoint that can be executed through various channels. Your sales team can use that. You can use that with your potential investors, but really get your story and your positioning well articulated, and then do it beautifully, but do it simply. I think one of the big variables I was going to add that helps minimize costs when you're doing an exercise like this is getting alignment first and getting agreement with your important stakeholders, and as much as you can, limiting those stakeholders. We've done, I've done websites and brand launches that have been done in 6 to 8 weeks with a very small set of stakeholders for the budget that, sort of closer to the budget that Ranjit reflected on. But the broader your stakeholder group and the more iterations you have on your strategy, I have seen those spread into multiple months. So, alignment, cohesion, and agreement is, I think, one of the key ways to save time and money. And I see Teresa and Ranjit nodding because I know we've all had these experiences.
And Teresa, did you want to say something, Ranjit?
Yeah, I just wanted
to
reinforce everything that Jill was talking about. It's there's a reason, there's the expression that you can have too many cooks in a kitchen, where all of a sudden, like the thing I think about, I don't know if you guys are Simpsons fans, but Homer gets a chance to design a car and he puts everything he wants in the car and they call it the Homer. And it's just the ugliest, most awful thing you've ever seen. And that can happen with a launch and with brand. Like you've really got to hone it down to your core principles, your core values, like Jill said. So it made me laugh, but I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah, and I think it's so true of any engagement that if it's extending out over time, and especially if you've engaged an external agency or partner to help you with it, that time is going to cost you.
Yeah.
And it's just the cost of the decision making costs there, right? So the further along, I think, as you had said, Ranjit, even thinking ahead toward a launch earlier on, you can start to get tighter on some of that storytelling internally first before you start to engage. It's going to make that process go so much smoother in terms of really refining it and writing it all down. And Teresa, the one thing too, when we think about cost and even the idea of like what the investment should be afterward, I continue to hear this question of, should I go with a PR consultant or should I get an agency? And if I work with an agency, what should that ongoing commitment be? So as it relates to launch or even after launch, how should our companies be thinking about that?
That's a great question, and we hear it all the time. I know you hear it all the time. So I think there are some really key considerations that a company should have in mind before they make that decision. One is there an internal stakeholder who will own PR? PR is not something that you just hand over to someone and they can execute. Here, go write a press release. There's a lot of information that has to come from the company. And so if you don't have somebody inside the company who has the time, back to that whole variable, then you might want to spend the money on an internal consultant for the time being who can really help manage that process. And this is somebody who might be engaged for 10 hours a week or 40 hours a week, even during the busy period. Now, if there is somebody, maybe it's a product manager, that's often the first role that we'll work with, who can own it. They don't have to do everything. You can find a really good consultant or agency. I prefer boutique agencies. I sound, biased because that's what I run, but there's a reason. I was inside 2 startups before I started Cogenta, and I saw what you get from, the larger agencies when you're a small company. And so if you can find a really good specialty firm, one that really understands the startup world, that understands the media landscape and has a dedicated person on their team who can work with you, then you probably don't need to spend the money on a contractor because that person will serve in that position. And that company, that agency knows how this works. They're familiar with working with founders, with people in sales and biz dev and all the different roles. And so they will understand the time that you don't have. And so if you do go that route, make sure you meet everybody on your team. Don't trust that just because you met the founder of the agency or the person who launched Amazon, 20 years ago or whatever, make sure that the person that's going to actually be working on your account is the person that you meet with. And chances are, if you go that route, you're going to get not just one person, you might have 2 or 3 people on your team. So meet those other support people as well. Find out what other accounts they're working on. And think about it. Do they have enough time to devote to you? Are they also serving a later stage company if you're early stage? And are they going to be pulled in a direction to work on that company's business? Those are all key considerations when you're deciding. Budget, I think you can find a good contractor who comes in at 10 hours a week that costs the same as a boutique agency. You just might have some trade-offs on the amount of service you get. You might get a little bit more for from the contractor than the agency. That boutique agency will probably cost a little bit less than a larger agency. I'm also a fan of mid-size agencies. I don't usually go the large route because they tend to work with the bigger brands. But a mid-size firm that again has a specialty could be a good route. Again, you really have to know who's my team. And, when you're thinking about budget, it's a range. I mean, it could be anywhere. It's going to be a percentage of what Ranjit said, and it could be anywhere from, 10,000 to 40,000 for your agency, depending on what your story is, whether you're going out to consumer publications or business to business publications. Is it a seed stage company and your primary objective is to get one story in TechCrunch? That might cost less money, but do you have your PR messaging? No, you don't. You're going to have to invest in that. So you really need to go into it and understand, what do I have? What do I need? And find a good partner you can trust, because chances are you don't know what those numbers look like. The person that you're talking to will, and so have them help you with your budget.
Yeah. I think going back to that, marketing advisor who can at least kind of oversee or be that, and no matter where that comes from, whether that's through our portfolio services team or somebody else that you bring in, just to help guide through this process and play point and in helping make some of those decisions and helping find what's right for your business. And I feel like the term "it depends" is coming up a lot in this conversation, which also lends itself to having that thought partner to help you decide, what does it depend on for our business? And we already talked a little bit about launch timeline, but we didn't really introduce the concept that you'll see in the launch playbook that we're going to be sending out, is this concept of a soft launch. And we've kind of touched on that a little bit, where, maybe a funding announcement at a seed stage is a little bit more of a soft launch, and you're not even ready to have a big GA announcement about your product. And then we introduced the concept of the hard launch, which your primary objective there is very likely going to be acquiring net new customers. You're ready to bring your product out of beta into GA, and you've got pipeline targets you're looking to hit. And so, assuming the hard launch scenario, what are some of the things in terms of timing that should be considered in preparing for that? Ranjit, what do you think in terms of thinking about the stages of maturity and those building blocks? What would you put if you had to put a marker for how much time to plan?
Sure. So absolutely looking at it through the lens of early stage startups, right? So seed stage or Series A at the very latest. I've always loved the 90-day window for a launch. I think we've probably all read about the paradox of choice, right? Like, once you have too much time, you can think about all the things you could do, and there is such a thing as too much time. 90 days, just through my practical experience, has been the right window. Where anything less than that, like if you want to try to do something in 60 days, it's doable, right? Teresa, you made the point of hey, 6 weeks is maybe a decent window to target some key journalists and try to get on their radar, pitch the story, get them to write it, and get it published. But if you want to build your message, you want to do your website, you want to get a couple of key customer and or partner quotes, all of those things are doable in a 90-day window. Anything less than that can, one or more of those long poles will break, and then all of a sudden you'll be scrambling. Anything more than 90 days becomes well, then, you've probably got other more important things you could do in the first 30 of those, 120 days, and then revisit it as a 90-day window. So again, as Renee, you pointed out, this is your mileage will vary kind of overall conversation. But if I had to kind of put a stake in the ground, I would say 90 days is a reasonable timeline. That's what you should shoot for.
I agree. I'll pipe in there real quick. I agree, because oftentimes, even at the 6-week window, somebody will come to us, and if they don't have their messaging in play, then we're going to spend the first 2 weeks just getting the message good enough, which is fine. I'm a big believer in the organic message and not spending too much time and money on your PR message. It's different from the brand message, because the PR message will shift. It's going to shift after your first customer deploys. It's going to shift after you talk to 10 potential customers, based on what you're hearing from them. But if you don't have that in play, then you're going to work with us and we're going to help you do it, but it's going to push out your launch date.
Yeah. And thinking about like that launch date, Teresa, all this prep goes into getting ready, and we're talking about timelines. Like, what does that look like on launch day? Because I think we talked about the concept that maybe it could be a little bit and feel anticlimactic sometimes. So what's that look like?
Yeah, I always equate it to the wedding that you plan for a year and a half, and then the wedding day happens, and then you wake up the next day and you're married, and you're like, what now? And, hopefully you found a partner that you wake up and you go, let's go play tennis. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And you're on to the next thing. You start building a life, right? Launch is the same thing. It's not the end all be all. It can feel like it, especially the first company that you've built. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm launching my company. You spend all of this time going into it. Your TechCrunch story hits like you wanted. You get 3 stories in trade magazines. That launch day itself, all of the news is coming out because you've done your pre-prep work and you had 3 months in advance to prepare for it, and everything's great. And then the day after, you're like, okay, now what? And your website traffic starts to go down a little bit. And a week later, nobody remembers who you are. And so the big thing is to remember your launch day is going to be exciting. It's going to be momentous. You're going to have coverage, hopefully, that you can celebrate. But that's just the beginning. It's we used to say launch, listen, and learn. So you launch, that's great. Now let's hear what people are saying about us. You're going to learn from what they say about you and apply it. That's where you want to start thinking about what's next. And going back to contractor or agency, I'm a big believer in projects in the beginning. If you're a seed stage company, find somebody who can grow with you. If you're an A or a B stage company, you may be ready for ongoing PR. You may have enough, and there are a number of points that you can look for. In fact, I think I'm doing a blog post for Norwest on this. But look at when your cadence of news starts to kind of mesh together, and you need to have more support. What can you be doing in between news cycles? Because you probably aren't going to close a customer a month or even a quarter, potentially, not one that you can have talk to the press. And so what are your milestones and what can you do to fill those gaps? Thought leadership and content development are huge. Podcasts are great. There are a number of things you can be doing proactively from a PR perspective without actually having news. And if you have a good partner who can manage that process for you, then I'd say launch and then figure out what the next 90 days look like. And then the next 90 days after that, until suddenly you're able to plan 90 becomes, 6 months. And when you can go 6 months, you probably should have somebody, an agency engaged with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Teresa, I in past lives, PR is not my strong suit, as we've discussed on some of our internal calls. But one really powerful concept that was shared with me is the idea that each piece of news has a shelf life, and there's stuff that you can bank, right? There's stuff that you as a startup have a lot of control over, like a product announcement or maybe a partnership announcement. So those are the things that you can potentially slot in as you're chasing stuff that's more topical or that needs a journalist or an analyst to lean in and say, hey, I'm going to do this in April. So this is the April thing, then I can slide out some of the things that I have more control over. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The things you can control and then the things that you can't. And that's where, like I had mentioned, podcasts, we love them because they have a long, long shelf life. You just mentioned analysts. That's another thing that companies don't always think about early on, and a big part of a launch too, especially if a product is ready to go to market at the point of the launch. So, thinking about all of the different constituencies, how you could be working with them, getting in front of the analysts should be your absolute next step. After, it doesn't have to happen before the launch if you're early stage. However, like I said, if you have product, then you probably want to be in front of the analyst in a good world 6 weeks in advance. And so, it's not just a one and done. It's okay, I've got that. Now what? And a good partner is going to look at what your budget is and say, okay, you know what? We can't do all of this, but maybe we can focus on this piece for the next 3 months. A good partner is going to help you, and a good advisor is going to help you find that partner if you don't have them.
Yeah.
Yep. And focus on the things that are going to be most impactful, because there's things that you could be doing a lot, but knowing that you have to kind of make some of those trade-offs.
I'll give one note of caution. Sorry to interrupt there.
Of course.
We started working with a company. We've been working with them for about 4 years now, but they had another agency on board before we took on the account. And the first thing I told the CEO when we met was, I don't care if you hire us. I'd like to work with you. But even if you hire someone else, you need to move away from your current strategy, and you need to move away from your current agency, because the agency had this seed stage company on a number of announcements per quarter plan. And so they paid a retainer for up to a certain number of announcements. Seed stage companies shouldn't have more than one a quarter, typically. You rarely have news at that point. So you really do have, that's where I think it's important to know your partners and have guidance in finding them if you haven't done it before.
That's a great tip. And we're almost at time here, and I wanted to make sure we left a little time to take some questions from the chat. But before we wrap up the more formal panel, I wanted to ask each of you, what's one tip that if everybody on this and listening to this, if they don't remember anything else about launching, remember this. What is that one takeaway that you want to make sure is seared in everyone's brains? How about you, Jill?
Well, I think we touched on this, but I think picking your partner and making sure you have the right team involved that can, to your point, Teresa, be honest with you and push you forward on the right path to spearhead and quarterback your process, and really understands your goals and can, bring value and coach you along the way. I think picking the right partner and team to support around your launch is probably the biggest tip I have. And I would say, do the research and make sure you really understand if you have the right person or team on board, because you can address problems that come up and you can, make adjustments to the strategy if you have the right team and partners surrounding you. The rest of that falls into place if you trust and can have that relationship in place.
Yeah. And Ranjit, what would you add to that?
So yeah, definitely agree with Jill, what you just said. For me, I think the one takeaway would be whatever you do at launch, and Teresa, this builds on the point you were making. There is a life after the launch. And I think it's important that whatever you do building up to launch is something that you can sustain going forward. So I've worked with a lot of firms where we're now 6, 9, 12 months post-launch, and we're looking back on it going, wow, we got so much coverage. Our website was so vibrant and new and dynamic. And now, like, since then, it's been kind of crickets. So you're much better off doing something more modest and keeping some of that powder dry and banking some of that budget, or even in just cycles from your own team, so that whether it's generating news, whether it's updating the website, whether it's writing blog posts, whatever it may be, it's actually something that you can sustain over the months and quarters to come, because your launch could be shiny and new, but Teresa, you're absolutely right. 3-4 weeks later, no one remembers. But every now and then, like a new prospect, whatever, a new potential partner, investor hits your website, they are absolutely 100% going to look at okay, what have these folks been talking about? Oh, they were blogging a lot, and there was a lot of news in Q4 of last year, and really nothing the last 6 months. And that absence of noise is very, very, very noticeable. So whatever you do, make sure it's something you can sustain well post-launch.
Well,
Great.
you covered the big ones, but so I'm going to get a little bit more tactical here.
Yeah.
Because I think absolutely everything you've said is spot on. But also, I think know the market. Every market's different, and today the market, the media market is different than it was, and the startup ecosystem is different than it was 6 months ago. We all know that. We still get a lot of companies who come in and say, "Well, my peer from MIT was covered in this article, and how come we can't get that kind of coverage? I expect that coverage." Know the difference. Every reporter who's out there right now has the same challenge as we do. They probably have more work than they can handle, more news than they can write, and they're looking for real strong stories. They need introductions. It's not always easy. A founder can reach out, a company can reach out. Sometimes we even advise that with certain reporters, but having somebody who understands the landscape and knows how to create a really good pitch is going to go a long way, because there's a lot of funding news to cover. And so yours needs to stand out. You don't want to be just any other fintech company or any other digital health company or any other developer tool. You really want a storyline behind that, and getting the right partners in place will help you get there.
Well, thank you for this great panel. And real quick, I'm going to do some of these questions from the chat rapid fire. So whoever wants to jump in and answer them, please feel free to do. First one here is, how do I know when it's the right time to bring in a marketing leader as an FTE, like a head of marketing FTE?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that, as that's kind of what I do for our portfolio companies, and even before I started working with Norwest. So generally, we've already talked over the course of the panel about, you need an outside quarterback, you need an advisor. If you are a technical founder, as many of our founders are in our portfolio company, you definitely need that leadership. So the general rule of thumb for me has been, if I'm spending up to more than like half my time with a particular company, that's a great benchmark that, okay, you probably need someone in-house. You've outgrown the fractional or advisor kind of stage, and you need at least like a director level, if not a VPM or a CMO. So that's the rough rule of thumb. Again, as with all things in this conversation, mileage may vary, but that's the benchmark I use. Like my mission with our portfolio companies is to execute myself into obsolescence, so that they can actually bring in, bring in someone full time. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'd add to that as well, is it also a consideration is, what type of launch are you doing? What are your post-launch plans? What is it? Are you really starting to ramp up your go-to-market plan and looking to bringing in your sellers, and so growing out that team, looking to create, hit pipeline targets in a little bit more of a repeatable and scalable way? Then it's time to also consider bringing in your head of marketing to help with really supporting those activities and starting to create your foundations, as well as start to create your demand gen plans as well. Another one that it came through here, let me see this one. It says, so what is the best way to select an agency, and should I use the same agency for website PR and brand? It seems like it could really add up.
So I would love to take this one.
Yeah.
And, I have been thinking about this a lot, and I'm actually writing the Insider's Guide to Hiring the Right Agency as a blog for Norwest right now. So I think the first step is really aligning around your objectives and your outcomes. You've got to understand what you're looking for so you can share that brief with the agency. The second thing I think is really important is to get recommendations and referrals, because you might think, oh, it sounds so cool to have big agency working on my brand, but actually the best agencies, to Teresa's point, are those agencies that are really going to understand your business, roll up their sleeves, work collaboratively with you. And you're going to find that out by asking people in your network and also the Norwest advisors who those kinds of agencies are, and make sure you're including the right kind of agencies in the mix, not only based on your objectives and outcomes, but you really need to understand your budget. That's going to play a big role in the type of agency that you should engage. And then write a brief to inspire that agency, get them motivated and excited about your objectives, and share in that process so they feel like they're truly part of your team, and provide, honesty, authenticity, and really clear feedback along the way. You'll get the best out of your agency. I think that to answer the question, should it be the same agency? That's another big one of it depends. I think it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. It depends on what your budget is, and it depends on the specialisms of the agencies that you're engaging. I think you can find really good boutique and mid-sized agencies that can be specialist and to do those brand and website together. I think PR is the one where I would say that is very much a specialist area of expertise. And not often do I see agencies that are really good at, sort of PR and really good at brand, web, and content. So I think that's one area that I would say specialist agency for PR is really important. Brand and website can be bundled together sometimes, as well as sort of campaigns and content when you get into those extending your brand expression. So long answer, sorry, but I'm passionate about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if I could layer in a point on that, and I think this applies to both Jill and Teresa, you've done awesome work building out the template that's going to be, part of the overall toolkit that Renee will share with our portfolio companies. But I think the other key thing, and I think Teresa, you made this point earlier in the call, was it's really about saying who's going to be on my team, right? Like who's, it's great that you had your best, you had your MD or your CEO, your founder, whoever pitched to me. That's awesome. Who are the 2 or 3 folks that are actually going to be holding my hand, over the next 6-12 months? Like, I think that is so key, because I think we've all suffered from a bit of bait and switch, but both in brand and PR. So
yeah, agreed. And a couple more, so 2 more, I think, and then we'll call it a day here. This one is, can you say more about how analyst relations fits into all of this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Teresa, I think either you or I could jump all this one. So maybe I'll kick us off, and feel free to correct and amend as needed. So Teresa made the point earlier about, especially for product-centric, launches, analysts are absolutely key. You need to have line of sight to what space you're in. It's funny, several years ago at the firm that I was at, we actually did an all-day session we paid consulting dollars for Forrester to come in, because we were trying to figure out what category we fit in. And even the Forrester analysts were super clear that the startup doesn't get to define the category. Forrester doesn't get to define the category. Forrester said Gartner defines a category. Like that's just the reality. So have a very, very clear line of sight to what is the space that you're going to play in the analyst mind space. And then where do you fit into that space? How do you differentiate? Who are the analysts that cover it, and what do they care about? And then, create a plan. They're people too, just like the journalists that we talk about in our PR track. There's a reason PR and AR go hand in hand. It's very much a parallel but similar process. So for launch, for any product-centric companies, which is the entirety of our portfolio, analysts should be right there, top of mind for you in your launch. And then Teresa, you can probably add a lot more wisdom than I can.
Yeah, you got a great basis, absolutely. But yeah, the analysts are the category creators, and that's great that Forrester will defer to Gartner. And for many of the technology companies in the portfolio, that is the case. We're working with a portfolio company right now, and there's an analyst in the he's more in the HR and employee experience space, and he just defined their category as they would want the category defined. That's what you want. Most analysts are not going to call a company buy whatever category they want, because they need to see. I always think of the Venn diagram, and you gotta latch on to something. So if you're creating a social platform, then you're going to be lumped into the social platform space, social media. But maybe you're doing something a little bit different, like this company I'm thinking about. There's is more of a belonging platform. And so you get the analyst to understand how you're like that, but you're so different. And then you get the analyst to say, as Josh Bersin did about Whisk, you're a belonging platform. That's what you're looking for. The way that happens is you get involved with the analyst even before launch. You know, to your point, it's a part of your rigor, and you talk to them after launch. If you didn't have an opportunity to talk to analysts pre-launch and you're an early stage company, that's okay. You've got a lot of time. You can do a nice buddy program with some analysts. You meet with them. They will want to meet with you because they get paid to understand the market. That's what you have to remember. They get paid, and they get paid if you engage with them, but an analyst's responsibility is to understand the market. And so it's really up to them to meet all of the different players. Now, if you don't convince them in that meeting that they should meet with you again, they probably won't. If you come in with something that's interesting to them, they'll meet with you again, maybe later in the year, definitely a year later, and certainly if you will pay them. But even if you're not paying the engagement, you can meet with these analysts usually once a year, sometimes twice. And they should absolutely be a part of the PR program.
Great. And then the last question here, which I think this is a great one to maybe wrap up on as well. And we won't be ready for a big launch until next year, but don't want to be completely dark before that. What are some ways that we can build content and media mentions before our bigger launch?
I can take that. I can kick us off at least, and then you two may have some thoughts as well. But content's huge, I think. And owned content is just that, it's owned. It's something that you create. So if you develop an article, it can't be self-serving if you're placing it in a third-party outlet. Fast Company is not going to write an article that you write about your technology.
Mm-hmm.
They will write something about the industry that your technology impacts. And if it meets their audience goals, you can place an article there. Number of outlets, and especially in the trades, a lot of the trade magazines don't have enough staff to create content for their outlets. And so they really depend on experts and thought leaders to help balance that. So if you are going after the employer space, employee benefit news takes a lot of content from companies. Again, it can't be self-serving, but it can talk about general trends. So establish yourself as a thought leader. And that's going to weigh into your company as well. It's all good. It gets your name out there. You'll get a little attribution at the bottom, and it will help grease the wheels leading up to your launch.
I would add, really spend some time capturing and documenting your customer stories. That is the first and most important thing, obviously, everybody needs for their sales presentations, for their website. And so really getting those customer stories told in a compelling way, packaged up, getting those approvals done, that will get you, really set up for when you are ready to launch.
Yeah, 100%. And maybe I can tie both those things together, where my rule of thumb has been for things like Forbes and Fast Company and all of those types of outlets is write about the problem. People will, if you're talking about the pain they're feeling, they will lean in. And then if you can tie it without being self-serving at all and be like, yeah, this is how we did it for bank X or manufacturer Y, then they'll be like, well, gosh, how'd you do that? And they'll come to your website. So, absolutely write about the problem and you'll never go wrong, I think.
Great tips. And I really thank you all for joining us today. And we're going to wrap it up now. And I'll leave everybody with a reminder that we've got in addition to all of the great advice that was given on today's panel, all of the materials that we're going to be sending along to come along with this, and inviting you all to engage with Portfolio Services to help put this playbook to use. And we'd love also your feedback on if this is answering your questions, or if there are some other questions that you'd like us to dive into a little bit more deeply. We're constantly, revising and updating our materials, and certainly can also sit one-on-one with you and your company to develop a bespoke plan that makes sense for your business and where you're at right now. So thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, team.